Metallica with Hardwired to Self-Destruct. The 8-year gap between studio albums is now over. We have brand new Metallica. Yes, solo studio album. I know there was another one that was in between there with Lou Reed. You know, Lou. You want to know what I think about that album? Check out the discography review. Spoiler alert, not that good. But this is interesting because this is a double album. This is a 2-disc set, and it's not even 80 minutes long. You could easily put this on one CD. Instead, they opt to chop it in half. 6 songs apiece amid the 2 different discs. So, wow. That's a lot to really digest really right out of the gate. What were they thinking? What are they doing? And Kirk Hammett doesn't have a writing credit on this album as well, which is also interesting. But apparently, this all stems behind him losing a phone in 2014. He didn't have the 250 plus riff ideas that he already had for the album backed up anywhere, so old Kirk was at square one. Whatever. So we've heard 3 tracks off of this disc already, and those are Hardwired, Atlas Rise, and Moth in the Flame. 3 of the 6 off of disc number 1. And we kind of got an idea of where this album supposedly was taking us. That Hardwired was going to be, you know, that thrash metal identity that Metallica had. This is definitely one that feels like it could sort of be at home within the 80s style register that Metallica had in the thrash metal department, only, of course, really modified for 2016. You can hear that, you know, older, gruff voice of James Hetfield. I mean, these guys aren't spry. They're not young anymore. They're Metallica now. Yeah. But it was still a kick-ass track, whereas Atlas Rise and Moth in the Flame put them a little bit more closely knit toward a new wave of British heavy metal / hard rock identity with a little bit of thrash sporadically thrown in, Kirk Hammett specifically having a pretty nice solo on Atlas Rise. So, one final thing is that we had some predictions based off of that. Is the second disc going to be a little bit more experiment heavy, as Lars Ulrich had indicated that they took some risks, they took some leaps on this album. Let's solve all of these problems. Let's, you know, Sherlock Holmes this son of a gun. Let's talk about this full length. Hardwired and Atlas Rise we both know, but this is very important considering 77 minutes is the total runtime for this disc, and the first 10 are already pretty kick-ass. You know, we already have a good indication of this album not, you know, crashing and burning from the very start. Hardwired especially being that sort of thrash metal quickest song on the album, barely reaching the 3-minute mark, and this is one that's going to sort of set up a, you know, really strange bookend philosophy. We'll get to it, believe me. But Atlas Rise easily could have sort of taken this down and really led it astray. You know, whenever you first saw that song title, it probably, you know, propagated a lot of different things in your mind, and you weren't really sure what to make of the whole thing. But once you heard the song, you started to understand sort of the twin identity that Metallica was able to showcase right out of the gate on these first 2 tracks. So Now That We're Dead is the first song that could potentially derail this train. And it really doesn't do that. In fact, this is a drum fill right at the beginning that feels like it's right out of a Megadeth song, and I'm struggling to think of which one that it is, but whenever you hear this, it's the first thing that comes to mind. I want to say it's like Angry Again, or perhaps one of the singles off of The World Needs a Hero. That one actually sounds a little bit closer to actually being true. So somebody help me out. Let me know what I'm thinking in the comments below if you're a freaking mind reader. Now that we're dead, baby, we can live forever. That's a line that you really think that you were going to hear not only on a Metallica song, but also in a heavy metal song, but here we are. And overall, this has that sort of hard rock register, that late 70s, early 80s hard rock side that really, it paints this picture whenever heavy metal was not an officially really, you know, held genre tag. It's right there within that era, within that style. Is it rock? Is it metal? You know, we've done a couple videos like that with modern bands, but back then, everything was just considered hard rock or heavier rock, and this is what sort of that whole idea means, and it definitely has that register to it, which is pretty well handled on this. Moth in the Flame gives them 4 for 4. Thus far, we've started off pretty darn strong on disc 1, and these are songs that are very easy to return to, and a lot of Metallica songs actually are, but it's something where to have that level of sort of consistency right out of the gate, it sort of reminds me of the consistency we've heard on the most recent Korn album, The Serenity of Suffering, where the first half actually really overburdened the second half by being as really well executed as it was. Now, the last 2 cuts off of the first disc are Dream No More and Halo on Fire, and this is where the wheels start to get a little bit wobbly. Both of the songs are halfway decent. Again, Dream No More really propagates that idea of late 70s, early 80s hard rock / metal, where essentially it has all of those different identities sort of splashed together throughout the entirety of the track. You do get a fairly decent guitar solo on Halo of Fire, and at 8 minutes and 15 seconds, you hope that you would, considering it's the longest track on the album. As a closer, it's one that does bear in mind a little bit of memory, and plus Dream No More has a weird reference to Cthulhu, which James calls Cthulhu. Pretty hysterical stuff. I'm sure that, H.P. Lovecraft is rolling in his grave a little bit, but then again, do we really know how to say Cthulhu? Maybe it is Cthulhu, maybe it's something else, who the heck really knows? But overall, Disc 1 thus far has kind of gone off without a hitch. It's a pretty decent display. It's not necessarily thrusting us into this new stratosphere about how Metallica has all of a sudden transformed back into the band that they were all the way back in the 80s or even in the 90s. Right now, the best way that you could identify it is a little bit of a thrashier load, or at least a load and reload that felt a little bit more focused. Considering those two albums, I kind of have a secret respect for both of them, but they did have moments that felt kind of disorganized or just, not very well put together. As I famously stated in the discography review that you could check out, if you took half of the songs off of Load and half of the songs off of Reload and put them together, you'd have a hell of a load, a really solid album. So moving on to Disc 2, this is where we need to learn if things went a little bit more experimentative. And it kind of does, and it kind of does in a way that's not all that great. Confusion is a fairly decent opener. It's not one that's necessarily a rip-roar thrash fest. It's not one that's going to mirror Hardwired in that idea. So that whole, bookend philosophy is not yet applying. It's not applicable as of this moment. But it's still decent enough that it sort of keeps up some of that momentum that we were slowly but surely derailing during the latter portions of Disc 1. But then Man Unkind comes, and this is where things start to get a little dicey. This is easily the worst song off of the album. The lyricism on this is not that great. The music really doesn't help very much. It's just a track that feels like a throwaway, almost like an idea that barely made the cut, and only made the cut because maybe somebody had a boner for it. I don't know. This is just a track that doesn't feel all of that well designed, and really kind of tears away some of that momentum that was sort of clinging on already by a thread. Here Comes Revenge is a song at 7 minutes and 17 seconds that almost follows Man Unkind into that dark pit of despair, but is really saved by a little bit more of a solid composition that does involve a little bit more of that experimentation that we've been talking about. This almost feels like they are writing in the same style of Load and Reload, especially the style of Load. Not quite Bleeding Me, which is an impressive track, but almost as though they were kind of within that same philosophy. There is a little bit of that blues that creeps in every now and again on tracks such as this one, and then especially on Am I Savage, which is the fourth cut off of Disc 2. This is one that also sort of suffers a little bit from some known Metallica tropes. For example, you can see the ending lyrically coming, that all this time James actually been talking about himself. Uh-oh! But at the same time, this is one that feels a little more structured and organized than the two that came previous. And once again, we kind of noted the fact that it's a subtle reference to Diamond Head with their song Am I Evil. Now, Murder One is an interesting one, considering you would not expect it, but this is actually a tribute to Lemmy Kilmister. I know, it's called Murder One, and it's a tribute to Lemmy Kilmister, but you have to listen to the lyricism. There's just, tons of references to Motorhead littered all about this song and the lyricism, almost like what Dave Mustaine did with Victory with his own material, because, Dave got himself a big old head. But Metallica is able to pull off a fairly decent tribute to Lemmy with this track. It doesn't sound like Motorhead at all, really. This is instead one that has an identity really all for itself. And aside from Hardwired, which is that thrash metal destruction, Murder One is the most unique and individual song off of this album. So it's a fitting tribute, and it's definitely moving whenever you read some of the comments that Lars in particular had for Lemmy really after his passing. But then we get to spit out the bone. This is the finale of this big time disc, 7 minutes and 9 seconds, and holy shit. This is where the bookend philosophy comes in. This is thrash metal. This is Metallica being the Metallica from the 1980s. This is easily their thrashiest and most destructive song, since the Black Album or even since And Justice for All. Take your pick, really, because there were some, real destructive tracks off of, the Black Album. And you just kind of had to look at them and look for them a little bit. But damn, this one has all of the aggression, it has all of the speed, everything that you could possibly want and more. What a finale. This actually saves Disc 2 from being just an all-out shitfest. This is an exercise at times to listen to, but it is also, in spite of it not maybe being the legendary album that we were hoping for, it is easy enough to go back to that it does allow secondary, tertiary, and all plays after that to feel very natural and not feel like a strain. You're not looking at this album like, I really don't want to touch that again. It's instead an album that you want to approach. It's one that you want to give that extra listen to and give it those additional chances. And it's based off of the fact that it's not that bad of a disc, There are a couple of hiccups here and there where it feels like the band just gets a little bit off-centered, or maybe their songwriting prowess is just not really full-lengthable anymore. They write some solid singles like Hardwired and Atlas Rise, but it's not something that completely feels like a total package. It's a lot like Load and Reload in that regard, but you still go back to it, and you still are really enthralled by this album, considering you might still hear something or catch something that you didn't see or hear before. I'd give this album an 83 out of 100. It does have solid ideas. It does paint itself as a band that is showing its age a little bit, but it's still also a very charming album. There's many aspects about it that draw you back in, as I just mentioned, and that's a strong idea. Did they definitely take more risks on the second disc of this album? They did, and they didn't really pan out the way that I'm sure that they hoped. I would talk about disc 3, but all that you're getting is the Lords of Summer, a lot of live tracks, 2 covers, one of Deep Purple and one of Iron Maiden. We know Metallica's good at covers, and then of course the Ronnie Rising medley from the Dio tribute, which was, it was amazing. So if you like Metallica, pick that one up. If you don't need all of the extras, then just scope out the 2-disc selection of this album. It is not as bad as some people will say that it is. But I want to know what you think about Hardwired to Self-Destruct. Let me know in the comments below. I'm coverkillernation. I'm shutting up because I want to hear from you. I'll talk to you next time. Take care. Hey guys, thanks for viewing this video. If you want to see the Metallica discography referenced many times throughout this album review, scope it out on the left. On the right, find out 5 reasons why people hate Metallica. Why would they do that? You can also subscribe and check out the Patreon. I'm coverkillernation. I'll talk to you next time. Take care.